Hi, I'm Doyle.
And I'm Jordan, and I've got something to say. We've got a topic we want to cover tonight. Doyle and I have kind of talked a little bit about this, and just kind of want to get it like a little bit of an introductory take on this because this is, I think, sort of a thing that's going to be developing, and we want to be sure that we don't try to encapsulate our entire opinion about it because we don't know exactly what's going to be unfolding with it. But we want to get kind of our first thoughts about what's going on here because honestly, to me, it's a little crazy. So I just kind of want to broach the topic. So this is again around the pandemic situation that we're in, and kind of the idea of getting people back to work, reopening the economy, reopening sort of civil society, things out there outside of our own homes, and getting back to that normal life, doing the things we all used to love to do, even aside from work, and all of that sort of stuff is very important for the human psyche and just kind of the human experience generally. And that's interesting. And I think at some point I would like to talk about that. And I know Doyle, you have a lot of thoughts about that too. But
Yes.
particularly, one of the things that I want to talk about is something that I know is a guideline in Washington State and also in Maine. This may be the case in other states as well with kind of their reopening plans, but I'm not sure which of them it would apply to. But just the fact that exists in any state to me is a little silly. And I kind of want to talk about it. And what that is that, and I'm not sure about the wording with Maine's. I do know that they have a similar thing in place, but for Washington State, for restaurants particularly, they're going to allow whatever the government order, or however you want to couch it, is going to have verbiage to say that restaurants can operate with in facility dining. So they're going to welcome in customers again, which one I think is a great thing that's going to be happening. But there's a stipulation in this phase of the reopening plan that those restaurants have to collect the information for the people who dine inside their restaurant. So first, I think in Washington State, it's at least first name, last name, phone number, and email address. So they have to have a registry of every individual who comes in and dines there. And Maine has a similar thing where they have to keep that registry, but I'm not sure what details Maine requires. I just know that I saw some of that about Washington State. And so to me, that's extremely silly, one, and two, it's a little bit of a dangerous precedent. But that's me diving in a little too fast. Let me at least give the rationale that they present for wanting to get that information. What I have read, and this, I've not read the actual government orders, so take that for what it's worth. But from what I have read, the reasoning behind the collection of this information is so that if there is an outbreak in particularly that restaurant or in that area of SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, the coronavirus, then they can use that information to contact and make those people aware that that happened. And then, just in a general sense, for contact tracing. So to see who had contact with whom during this reopening period, which I think that is a real overblown rationale. So let's take out the contact tracing part. We'll talk about that second. First, to talk about the notification aspect of it. Well, it's going to be very publicized if there's an outbreak at a restaurant or near a restaurant that you've gone to after all of this. And I
Is
think
there
you're
an
going to go ahead.
is there an unsubscribe button?
Right, right.
Yeah.
Uh,
Anytime your email address aren't,
yeah,
I
exactly.
make it a little
Or a
tongue in
double
cheek.
opt in.
Yeah.
Um, but it's really silly for that, because if you will know if you've dined at that restaurant, and when you did, or at least approximately when you did, and in that area, right? So the notification aspect of it is a little silly because I'm taking the risk going out that I know that might happen, that I might get infected. So then it's my responsibility to keep up with, has there been any outbreak, to know if I'm infected or not. But the reality is, if I'm worried about being infected, well, I'm probably, if it's a problem, then either one, I'm probably already uh, sick, or have been impacted, or two, I've already infected the person I'm worried about impacting with that. So it makes no sense from those grounds. And then the other side about contact tracing, um, that what's the end to that becomes the question, right? Do we start a registry for all businesses always, for who's gone where whenever? Um, so how is that not de facto, surveillance of all of our economic activity, which is an extremely dangerous precedent for lots of
Yeah,
different reasons. But Doyle, I've talked a lot. I want to let you kind of speak to this a bit,
sure.
what you think about it.
It seems simpler with the rationale behind it that you alluded to. Just contact trace the employees in the restaurant and let the patrons opt in to be notified if one of them becomes infected.
Sure.
Then they can accomplish the same thing without the unsettling aspect of, hey, to eat here, come give us your information. Give us information that is otherwise protected, and I understand the public health argument behind losing some of your privacy, but I think to your point, you mentioned a time or two, it's sort of silly sounding in a way, because why stop it at restaurants?
Yeah.
Why not go to have a registry at every Walmart? Have you log into Walmart when you walk in, or log into the local grocery store, so that they know that you're there on what day and time. It really is uh, on the borderline of 1984ish.
Well,
Um,
here's the thing too, is that um, it can only be argued from the perspective of this order, or the recommendation, or whatever it is with this. Not, it's a requirement. This registration of people who come to the restaurants is a requirement. It's a condition of reopening. Uh, it it uh it can be. I don't see the argument from the side of the person going to the restaurant, right? It's for
right,
your
right.
protection or safety. If that's the case, let that person make the decision, if they think that it's risky, a risk they're willing to bear by going to that restaurant.
Sure.
So then only it must be a recommendation, or a requirement rather, from the side of uh, the people who may be second degree contacts. But then, isn't it on the responsibility of those second degree contacts to, be aware of the people that they, associate with? That, hey, have you been anywhere? If I'm really concerned about the virus, and I'm going to meet up with somebody, let's just say we still socially distance, or physically distance ourselves. I hate social distance, using that term,
Hmm.
but we physically distance ourselves, and maybe we even have masks, maybe we even have gloves, whatever. It's still on the side of whoever's concerned about getting infected to verify. Responsibility cannot be abdicated for your own health, for your own safety. And as soon as you think that you can, then you're completely unsafe because you have no control over it. Um,
Well,
so it's problematic, because you take that to the extreme, and then basically it's clear that it's just a feel good activity. It has no
mhm,
efficacy and no bearing, other than one, feel good, and two, control grab. So I mean, that's
right.
how, and then just the monitoring aspect. To me, that's the most insidious part of it, because we're pretty used to government control grabbing, and we're used to public campaign for feel good stuff.
The whole part, the feel good stuff. I understand the bureaucrats and the politicians
Yeah,
trying to and I'll use the word pander to their supporters or potential supporters by saying the feel good things.
they have incentive to
Uh,
do that.
that's exactly right. They've got a high motivation, getting reelected. And heaven forbid they should do the right thing and get the right result to get reelected. But that's a topic for another discussion later. But the whole part about forcing control on individual freedoms, and I, had this everything we've seemed to talk about recently has been centering around liberty and freedoms and individual freedoms. And I
Sure.
think let's just go ahead and call it out that we're coming from a spot of individual liberty and understanding of what that means to the individual, and not at what's been quote unquote bestowed upon the individual by the government. And this feels like a giant smack in the face of that individual liberty. To your point earlier about, well, if I'm worried about getting infected by something, well, then it's incumbent upon me to make the decision to protect myself from that.
Yeah.
It's not incumbent upon the government to take information from me to be able to protect me. And quite frankly, we know that this is not to protect me; it's to protect the government and others that that the government or the politicians are pandering to.
It's not a protection thing. It's a theater. It's security theater is what it is.
Right. Yeah,
It's to make it
absolutely.
look like something's going to happen when or be effective. And not only that, I truly think that it's another a thorn to set up a divide, because you're going to have people who, like us, are not just reticent, but are almost offended by the idea that the government says that you can, they not just you can, but you have to be doing this sort of data collection. But those of us like us that would voice that, we're going to irritate those who think that it's a true helpful measure, and people who may not have actually tried to analyze what efficacy there is with that sort of a measure. And maybe they have, maybe they truly believe that that measure is beneficial. That's totally fine. Here's the thing. The government doesn't have to require that. The people can demand that of the businesses that are trying to
Oh,
serve
sure.
them, and say, I'm not going to go to you unless you tell me that you're collecting everybody's information, and you collect my information when I come, and you can post that you're doing that. And then, I'll have that peace of mind that I feel like I require to go and patronize your establishment. And those of us who, well, I would, who feels like I do, can see that this restaurant says that they're collecting that information for those people, and I can know that I will avoid that restaurant because I don't agree with that sort of a mechanism or that approach at all whatsoever. And then everybody's happier. That they're able to serve the people, and the people who want that kind of service will get that kind of service, and people like me who do not want to be involved with that don't have to be involved with that. And I understand it's my choice if I would want to go to one of these restaurants anyway, but the problem is that you have this third party that is getting inside of our economic activity, and people want to have this cry that, oh, boo hoo your economic activity, I'm more worried about safety. That's fine, be worried about safety, stay home, don't go to this restaurant. I guarantee you that proprietor of that restaurant, if they knew that you were upset about, or you were concerned about safety, they would rather you not come in their restaurant, and they would rather serve people like me who would be okay with doing that.
Hmm.
They don't want to have to be. These restaurants don't want to have to be subjected to any less efficient activity than what they have to go through. But unless they really believe that it would be helpful, and if the proprietor thinks that, more power to him or her to implement such a scheme. The reality of it is, it would, if it weren't for this coronavirus situation, all of us know that wouldn't be stood for by anybody in any
Right.
sense of any timeline. Like it would have to be either one of two things: the government forces it, which is what we're seeing here, or two, there's literally no other option, and there cannot be any other option. And the only way for that to happen is for government to stop some other option from cropping up.
Right. So let me ask you a question here. Do you think, let's take the national chain restaurants out of this
Sure.
question focus for a moment, because the operators, the local operators of those chains, they have to do as they're told to from on high, from the corporate, right?
Certainly.
Versus locally owned. some of the restaurants that are locally owned, and may have only one location or one or two small locations in a city or something like that. And I mean, they obviously they're small businesses. Do you think that, and this is certainly an opinion, and it's not, I wish we could have researched this. Do you believe or think that these smaller restaurant operators that are struggling with the shutdown and are interested in the opening back up, do you think that they believe in the controls, in the practices, in the orders as the government has put in place, for them to shut down and not open up only 50%, 25% or 50%, and, shutting down their bars, and nobody can walk up to the bar and order anything. It's all table based, and they got to be, tables have to be 6 to 10 feet away from each other. Do you think they would do that, or believe that they need to do that, if the government wasn't telling them that they needed to do that?
I think that
Or they would do that, for that matter.
I think that it depends on the individual who's running this, who owns and runs the establishment, right? I think that it depends on their perspective, their opinion, right? It's going to be
Hmm.
some of the opinion, like small businesses, all businesses, but particularly small businesses, run a lot on the entrepreneurial opinion of the proprietor, and I think that that's the way that it should be, because then it's easier to match values as a consumer with the proprietor of your establishment. That's to me, that's really one of the drawbacks of things like chains, is that part gets abstracted away, and you get this homogenous, undecipherable, vanilla speak from these huge organizations that are just trying to offend as few people as possible and be relevant to as many people as possible. I don't think that on their face that there's anything wrong with those chains, but that's why I have personal
Right.
distaste for them.
Sure.
So I think that you would see a variety of those things. I think the more interesting question, though, which is kind of, I think, along the same lines as that one, is what would the preference be, uh, given a random chance of a particular proprietor being for or against, let's say 50-50 chance for or against those measures, what is the likelihood that they fall out where they would implement them? Right, because
Mhm.
there's the scenario where they're against it and they still follow the order. They're against it and they don't follow the order. They're for it and they don't follow the order, or they're for it and they do follow the order. And one of those is the most interesting economics scenario, and that's the
Mhm.
one where they're for it but they don't follow it, which is, I
Mhm.
think, what you would find, not intentionally, but you're going to find things like malicious compliance. You'll find things like lack of um, uh, diligence in applying it, because there's an economic cost to applying
Mhm.
this, and that economic cost, the large chains can amortize that cost across all of their business, whereas a proprietor of a single establishment cannot. So they must bear all of that cost within that single establishment. And this is
Right.
the part where people don't really understand economics, like the public at large, and they don't really need to. It's totally fine that they don't, because all they need to know is, am I being served the way that I want to, at a price, and at a, are all the things that I care about with this service, are they okay for me? That's all they need to know, and that's the beauty of free market economics, is that's all they need to know, and they know that instinctively, just because it's their preference. I mean, because
Mhm.
they could pick an irrational decision, quote unquote irrational decision, but it doesn't matter, because they don't have to be a rational actor. They just have to be the economic actor. But the economic calculation aspect of it is important for people who try to run businesses and try to understand, where are my costs, where can I save on costs, so that I can, price my whatever competitively, services, products, whatever, competitively. That cost that has to be borne by the small operator for enforcing regulations like this is
Mhm.
disproportionately high than versus a large chain. Thus, these kind of regulations are effectively market protections for large chains, and people
Right.
don't understand that. They think that they want to talk about how large corporations are terrible. These are exactly the reasons why large corporations become terrible. Is because they get this kind of indirect protectionism that people just don't realize is that's what's happening will happen in the market, whether
Right.
it's intended or
Right.
not.
So, you mentioned about people that would they be, I forget exactly how you phrased it, but about militant compliance or something like that.
Malicious
Um,
compliance. It's a
Malicious
that's
compliance.
the term where I'm going it's like here sweep up this floor, and then
Yeah.
you give it to me, and then I just like really and then I sweep it, but it doesn't really get clean because of the way that I'm doing it. It's like inefficient
Right.
and not a correct
Right.
approach, but I did it.
Uh, but I think another way to look at that the question of participation and compliance, and not so much in an economic way, but just in a psychological way, is look at some of the areas of the country where people have been pushing back on the orders.
Yeah.
California, Michigan, Florida, even in smaller degrees in other locations where they're
Texas.
pushing against Texas, where they're actually pushing against the government. And people, they're saying, "Oh, you're going to kill people. People are going to die because of this." And I think the point about the small business, the small operator in the restaurants that I really wanted to call out and was they are probably better equipped to make that individual decision about their operation. Right now, as a patron of that operator, if they choose to be a little careless, to your point earlier, then that becomes my responsibility to make sure, as long as they're not violating other standard health standards that we have, right? As far as
What?
food preparation and things of that sort, but not this pandemic uh, public health kind of guidance or orders that have come down, because they're looking at it, and people always talk about, well, we're saving lives with this quarantine during the pandemic. We are. There's I don't think anyone with any modicum of common sense would argue that there aren't some lives being saved, but it doesn't mean that we're not losing lives too.
Well, I mean, with it's a non-argument saying that we're saving lives because we would be saving other kinds of lives by going out and
Exactly.
not being quarantined. So it's I won't grant the ground that we are saving lives by doing this because that's a non-argument because it's a how do you look, is this glass half empty or half full?
Right.
And they're saying it's half full, it's half full, it's half full. Well, no, it's also half empty. You have to be realistic. It's also half empty, right?
Right.
Um,
Yeah, exactly. And so I guess the point I was driving at is if you follow this funnel and that you have this business proprietor that is making a decision for his or her business, let's say a restaurant, and let's say the government didn't say you can only open at 25 or 50% capacity, and then they chose to open it up full bore. Their employees didn't want to work in that scenario. I got it. It's a harsh decision, but it's still a decision whether or not to
mhm,
show up for work,
sure,
right? Nobody is an indentured servant in this country, not
right.
legally. If they are, then there's the
Well, that's not
we
legal.
need that's correct, right? If they are illegally an indentured servant, then that's something that needs to be addressed and corrected.
Yes,
So it's always a choice.
sure.
Now they may feel like they don't have a choice, but there's always a choice if they open up for the full, and then there are people, if there's demand there, then they will, then there's that risk that they are consciously or unconsciously choosing to bear by coming out and getting, but they're doing it today
Well,
all over.
the thing is, they have to know their community too. Particularly, again, I'm focused on small operator here, right? You know, one
Yes, yes.
restaurant, two restaurants. Um, They have to know their community because it's a double full risk for them if they were to open like full bore, let's say,
Yes.
because the
Right.
reason
Right.
being is they have to understand if their community is of a temperament that's going to piss them off that you did that,
Right.
right? And
Sure.
so if you open up full bore and then your community's not ready for that and they chastise you for that, you get the punishment, the negative side of risk of not having your patrons for that the expense of being opened, and you get the reputation damage of doing that because people will shame you for it. There are good mechanisms within the market to control such things. You don't need a decree from government on high, but
Right.
everybody thinks that this is what's so silly to me. I, the argument here is that these business owners are greedy and they want to open up and just so that they can make money. But here's the thing: if people didn't want them to open up, they wouldn't make any money. People would be like, "Heck
Right.
no, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to spend money at that." I don't agree with that. The problem is that they want they want to control not just the business. They want to they are affecting whether they want to or not. I don't care. I'm not going to cast judgment on their intent. They are affecting not just the business owners, but the people who want to patronize those businesses as well. And those people exist. At least some of those people exist, and they never talk about the impact of those people. It's always the greedy business owners that they're focused on. Business owners don't make money, particularly small operators don't make any money on being greedy. And the thing is, the orders that you're talking about are helping the ones that are more well off already. You're
Right.
protecting them. It's just so frustrating because it's like
It
you
is.
got to think about the system.
And all of this coming from this restaurant registry, which we only went down
Mm-hmm.
one path here of the ramifications and some of the potential unintended consequences. We haven't talked about many of the consequences per se, just more of the circumstances. But there are a myriad of unintended consequences that can come out of this, because it's Pandora's box to some extent, and that's
Yes.
always the fear. That's always the fear of the infringement of rights. Right? Is that okay? We're just a little farther. Just a little farther. Just a little farther, and before you know it, there are none left.
And how do you
There
roll
are
that
no.
back? The
Right.
problem is if it sits around for 20 years, it's permanent. It's permanent because what happens is you have children that are born and grow to voting age by the time that it even starts talking about rolling it back, and then it's too late then because they're used to it, and there's a large percentage that's their normal that they don't want to change, right?
Right.
And
That
it's
that's
just
the society those individuals, as you said, were born and grew up in. Yeah.
and so
You know,
it's
that
strange, man.
that also leads me to another teaser topic to throw out. Um, I went to one of these little half-day management seminars a couple of years ago. I've gone to a number of these over the years, and most of them are, you know, uh, they're interesting for 5 minutes or 10 minutes
Forgettable.
and forgettable. Uh, that's very true. With all good intent,
Sure.
the
Well,
teachers or instructors were very, interesting, engaging for the most
yeah.
part. I don't remember anyone ever going to any one of these things, and I'm talking about the little half day things, the $200, $250 deals that you go and they just throw a whole semester of management or leadership or whatever the topic is. They pour it into you all at one time, and you go out with a thimbleful of that you keep. Well, the one I went to about 2 years ago. The individual, and I'll bring him up later, bring his name up later in a future podcast, because I would love to have a conversation about him. I think he's just got a lot of good traits, a lot of good principles and practices that have been very inspiring to me. But he talked about in the workforce today, it's the first time in history that we have 5 generations in the workforce simultaneously, and talking about the dynamics. So he was talking from a standpoint of management, how to deal with the generational differences in the personalities and the work, ethics and the work philosophy, and not that one generation is necessarily harder working per se, but they are different working,
Yeah.
and they're engaged for different reasons. And he mentioned about the millennials, and he described each generation, over the course of a few minutes, but in such a concise way that at my age, I am in one of those five generations, but I'm familiar with all five of them to some extent. And it was clearly it was like getting a history lesson, a 19th century or a 20th century history lesson, U.S. history lesson, in 30 minutes. I mean, it just was but it was so compelling and made so much sense to me. He presented it in such a way that it stuck with me for 2 years. And that, to your point about the change in rights and the
Not changing
freedom,
rights.
correct.
Change in
The
law. Just it's easier
the
to
change
state
in
as
law.
change in law.
Right. The change in law, and how things that, the one generation, the generation, I'm in a baby boomer generation, but how the laws that the boomers would look at and go, oh, that's horrendous, that maybe, the millennials or the X generation, Generation X or Generation Z, they may look at it and go, that's normal. What's so bad about that? It's based on how they grew up.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I think there's some really compelling things to think about there that would help, at least me, have a clearer picture and understanding of why so many citizens and people in the United States today don't question some things that, to me, I just can't fathom not being questioned.
Well, it's because
Because
it's
registering when you go to a
yeah.
restaurant,
Well,
you give me your name on
that's
this.
that's precisely the point I was getting at, and I think that you're just articulating it more. Is
Yep.
that about the kid being born into a certain state, and then 18 years later, all of that's normal to him or her, right? It's I don't know if this is a real term for it, but I call it progressive normalization.
Mhm.
And so when I say progressive, I don't mean
Great term.
necessarily like what's that?
That's not really the scientific term. It's a great term. I
Well,
like
yeah,
it.
and when I say progressive, I don't necessarily mean like
Well,
progressivism per se. Although there a lot of that is enshrined in that too, or comes into that. But when I say progressive normalization, is like something that's wildly aberrant. And when I say aberrant, I'm not trying to cast a moral judgment in any sort of way, but just literally aberrant to somebody at point A. You take A plus 20 years, it is unlikely to be aberrant if in any way it has gained any sort of social acceptance. And so the danger in that is not progressive normalization in itself, right? Because we need progressive normalization, right? That's how we have kids that can deal with technology that some generations can't even deal with. We need that to progress as a species. The problem is that progressive normalization gets hijacked by I think by interests that are intent on pushing things that aren't necessarily in humanity's best interest. They're in the best interest for a certain group. And the problem is that I think people who are societal commentators at large are either one, they fall into the machinery that helps promote that, or two, they're focused on the wrong thing that is the cause of. They are like halfway there. They've half identified that this progressive normalization is the problem, but they believe that it's something different that's causing it. That it's the corruption of large organizations and capitalism, or it's just the corruption of capitalism itself. Capitalism is corrupted, or it's overly conservative values that are corrupted. And it's like, no, there's something more fundamental than that. We could go into a whole podcast about that, and I would like to talk about that some. So
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I brought that point up, because I
yeah.
thought that would be a really good a nugget to throw out from the standpoint of planting a seed for a future podcast. Okay.
I do want to wrap up with one example of malicious compliance that I was talking to my wife about regarding this restaurant registry thing, though, because I thought it was funny. I was like, if I were in one of these states running a restaurant where that was required of me, I would have my maitre d' stand at the door and say, as soon as some lady comes in the door, and say, Miss Jane Addams, good to see you again. And then she would be taken aback and say, what? And I would have my clipboard there. I was going to write this down. You're Miss Jane Addams, right? and just kind of inflect it like that. And then either she would get it and be like, "Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't hear what you said," and like, okay, I write down Jane Addams or whatever.
Right.
Or if not, then okay, well, what's your name, and write it down. The other example was that it's like, oh, your name's John Smith. Okay, they really tell you the real name, and then I either write down, Trey Smith, or just like something completely different, Trey Johnson, or I just write like J line T line, and it's like, oh, that's just how I write. You can't read it. I'm sorry, that was my record. That's the malicious compliance thing.
So I mean, because what are they going to do? They're going to ask for your ID?
Yeah, well, I mean, even if you did that, how are you going to record it? That's the problem. Right. Is like, yeah, you have to do that, but how do we record it? There's not a systematized way. And if I'm a mom and pop, sandwich shop or something, I'm probably still just taking orders on a pad, like an order pad or whatever. You think I may not even have a computerized point of sale system in either. I may just have like a till or whatever.
Right. So hopefully this whole idea of the restaurant registry will down the vine, for lack of the things that you just mentioned, right? The coherence and people's compliance, right? Because I mean, quite frankly, if it's intended for contact tracing, but if the information is not accurate, then it's actually going to do more harm than good.
Man, if I all I know is that if I went to a restaurant around here, they would say, "What's your name?" I would say Jay Pritzker. And what's your address? Springfield, Illinois. Give like the state capitol building or whatever. And it's like, what are they gonna do? Say I'm not gonna serve you?
Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. 123 West Lane. What? Just like make something up, like whatever. Like there's not gonna be any way to prove it. And then the other thing is like, yeah, if they make you show an ID, I would print off a fake ID like with the name and stuff. And here, when you're getting a new ID, they don't give you the ID at the DMV facility. They literally give you a print off, a piece of paper that has a picture of the new ID on it. And so it's like I could just be like, man, yeah, I just got a new ID. I haven't gotten the actual card yet. This is my ID right now.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we actually are going to be able to end this on a positive note, considering how I think you and I both feel pretty strongly about the concerns about this restaurant registry idea, and hopefully it will.
It could go down a dark path, and I don't think it's never the intention of these things. I want to be as generous as possible and say I don't think that's the intention here at all. But the intention of the people who are putting this in place are those aren't the people I'm worried about. I'm worried about the people who are going to use it as a tool to go down a dark path.
Right. I mean, and you said, I think you said this in a previous podcast about good intentions. The path to hell is paved with good intentions, and that's why we have to be real careful. And it's difficult. It really is difficult because it's easy to judge people's motives by the fact that you disagree with what they're suggesting or what they're supporting.
Sure. And it's easy to be overly emotional about it too. It's hard to disengage that and try to rationally approach the topic. And that's the problem with this order. And this is literally the last thing I say about it. I think that's literally the biggest problem with this order is that once you approach it with any modicum of rationality, it just falls apart on its face because it just doesn't do what it intends to do. And in fact, it's like I said, it's silly. I just think it's silly.
In the emotional aspect right now during this pandemic situation that we're all facing, everything is hyper emotional.
Sure. And understandably so. That's the problem. And so you have to be doubly vigilant to not let that infect you.
Exactly. Well, all right. I think we ended up on a positive note. I think we both have a smile on our face, so that's a good thing. I like those conversations. All right. So I guess till next time, Jordan.
All right. Well, it was a good conversation. We'll see you.